There is a particular kind of evening that many people know but rarely describe out loud. You sit down after dinner, you open whatever streaming service you happen to use, and you scroll. You scroll past one title, then another, then another. Some of them you have already heard about. A few of them have been praised by critics, recommended by friends, mentioned in conversations you half listened to. And yet, after 20 minutes of looking, you close the application and watch something you have already seen. Something old, something you know. It is not that nothing was available. The opposite is true. There has never been more available. There are hundreds of films, thousands of episodes, entire libraries of music, documentary series that could fill a week. The problem is not scarcity. The problem is something harder to name. The problem is that nothing called to you. Many people feel this and say nothing about it. They assume the fault is theirs. They tell themselves they are getting too old to appreciate what the young people enjoy, or that their tastes have calcified, or that they simply need to make more of an effort to understand what is current. They carry a quiet guilt about it, as if cultural disengagement is a kind of failure, a sign that they have stopped growing, stopped being curious, stopped trying. But there is another possibility. One that is less comfortable to admit, because it asks us to look at something bigger than our own preferences. What if the disconnection is not about you? What if something genuinely changed, not in your heart, but in how culture itself is made and for whom it is intended? This video is about that question. It is not a complaint. It is not a defense of the past against the present. It is not going to tell you that everything was better before, because it was not. The past had its own failures, its own blind spots, its own dullness. There were terrible films made in every decade, formulaic music, television that wasted everyone's time. Nostalgia is not a reliable narrator. We remember the things that moved us and forget the vast surrounding terrain of mediocrity. That is how memory works. It is selective in precisely the ways that flattery demands. But something has shifted in the way culture is produced and delivered over the last 3 decades, and that shift has real consequences for people who built their inner lives in relationship to a different kind of art. Most of us did not realize we were doing it at the time. You do not know, when you are 22 and sitting in a dark cinema watching a film that will stay with you for the rest of your life, that you are being given something irreplaceable. You do not know, when a song comes on the radio in your car and suddenly names something you have been feeling for months, that you are receiving a gift that took considerable human effort to make. You simply experience it, and over years, those experiences accumulate into something. They become the texture of your inner life. They become the reference points you use, even unconsciously, when you try to understand yourself. Think about the films you return to, the ones you watched more than once. Not because they were comfortable or simple, but because they gave you something you needed. A way of seeing something about work, or love, or family, or your own particular fear of certain kinds of failure. The films that got under your skin. The albums you know so well you can hear what comes next before it arrives. The books you have read twice and would read a third time. These are not casual entertainments. They are part of how you understand yourself and the world. What happens when the culture stops making things like that? Not entirely, not completely. There are still films that matter, still songs that can stop you in the middle of a day and make you feel something true. But they are harder to find now. They arrive less often. The mainstream, what is promoted, what is celebrated, what dominates the conversation, has reorganized itself around a different set of values. And for many adults who remember a different arrangement, the result is a kind of quiet cultural orphanhood. That phrase, cultural orphanhood, is worth sitting with for a moment. An orphan is not someone who has lost interest in belonging. An orphan is someone who has lost the thing they belong to. And that is a very different situation. The feeling many adults carry is not indifference. It is something closer to grief. A grief for a relationship that existed, that was real, that gave something, and that is now harder to find. There is also something else underneath it. A kind of puzzlement. Because the culture has not become poor. It has become immensely rich, technically speaking. The films of today have visual effects that would have seemed miraculous 20 years ago. The production values of mainstream television have never been higher. Music is available in quantities no previous generation could have imagined. And yet, paradoxically, the experience of being genuinely moved, of having a cultural work reach inside you and rearrange something, has become rarer for many people, not more common. That paradox is worth examining. More culture, less nourishment. More content, less meaning. It is an odd inversion, and it is not accidental. It is the predictable result of a set of choices made over many years by the industries that produce and distribute culture. Choices that made economic sense in their own terms but that, in aggregate, changed what culture is actually for. Today, we are going to look at what changed, how it changed, what it costs us, and what it might mean to live thoughtfully inside a culture that no longer quite speaks our language. To understand what happened to culture, you have to start with money. Not because money is the only thing that shapes art, it is not, but because the financial structure of the entertainment industry is what determines what gets made, how much of it gets made, and for whom it is made. And that structure changed dramatically between roughly 1990 and today. In the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Hollywood produced a wide range of films for a wide range of audiences. There were blockbusters, yes, the summer spectacle always existed. But alongside the spectacle, there was a robust middle tier. Films made for adults. Films with modest budgets, $20, $30, $40 million, that told stories about people navigating complicated lives. Dramas about relationships, about work, about aging, about moral choices that did not have clean outcomes. Films that could afford to move slowly, to trust the audience to stay with them, to let a scene breathe without needing to advance the plot. Films that did not need to be the biggest movie of the year to be profitable. Films that assumed the audience was an adult with an interior life worth exploring. That middle tier has largely disappeared from mainstream Hollywood. What replaced it was the franchise, the sequel, the cinematic universe, the intellectual property. These are films built not around a story someone needed to tell, but around a brand someone already owned. And the economics of them are ruthless in a particular way. When a single film costs $200 million to make and another $200 million to market, the studio cannot afford to take a risk on a story that might not work. They need certainty. They need a built-in audience. They need something that can be sold globally without deep cultural translation, because the domestic market alone is no longer enough to justify the investment. And what sells globally, with minimal translation required, is spectacle, action, and characters that everyone already knows from a previous film or a childhood toy box. The result is a cinema that is technically extraordinary and emotionally thin. The images are more sophisticated than anything that could have been made 30 years ago. The sound design is immaculate. The scale is genuinely impressive. You sit inside one of these films and the craft is undeniable. But the human stories inside all that craft have been compressed, simplified, and in many cases abandoned in favor of plot mechanics that keep the mythology moving forward to the next installment. Characters are defined by their functions in the story rather than by the ordinary complexity of being a person. Emotions are calibrated to produce a specific response at a specific moment, rather than allowed to develop at their own pace. The film knows exactly where you should feel tension, and exactly where you should feel relief, and it delivers those beats with enormous professional skill. What it cannot do, what its economics prevent it from doing, is surprise you in any deep way. This is not the fault of the filmmakers in most cases. There are talented, serious, thoughtful people working inside these constraints who do what they can. But constraints shape everything. When you are making a film that must appeal to a 12-year-old in one country and a 40-year-old in another, and also sell merchandise, and also set up the next film, you make different choices than when you are making a film for thoughtful adults who live in one culture and share a set of references and are willing to be challenged. Television, for a time, filled the gap. The period roughly from the late 1990s through the early 2010s produced some genuinely serious, complex, adult drama. Long-form storytelling that had the patience to develop character across many hours, to sit with moral ambiguity, to resist easy resolution. This was not an illusion. It really happened. For a decade or more, much of the most ambitious storytelling in the English-speaking world was on television rather than in cinemas. Shows that asked difficult questions about power and family and violence and complicity and what people are capable of when circumstances press them. Shows that assumed their audience could handle a season without a satisfying ending, could tolerate a protagonist who was genuinely bad, could sit with a moral situation that had no correct answer. That was remarkable. That was a genuine expansion of what the medium could do. But streaming changed that too. The economics of streaming are different from the economics of subscription cable. When you are competing for attention not against other television channels but against everything, social media, short-form video, video games, the open internet, you begin to optimize for a different outcome. You optimize for the show that keeps people watching the next episode immediately. And that is not always the same as the show that gives people something worth thinking about afterward. Binge watching, paradoxically, made depth harder to sustain. When there is always a next episode immediately available, the show cannot afford to let you sit with a difficult feeling. The feeling has to either resolve or escalate. It cannot simply persist and deepen at its own pace, the way the best television once could. The result is more content than ever, and a great deal of it is competently made. The craft level has never been higher. But the proportion of it that is genuinely trying to say something about adult human experience, rather than simply generating sustained engagement, has changed. The ambition of the industry has narrowed, even as its technical capabilities have expanded. Music changed too, though in a different direction, shaped by a different set of disruptions. The music industry collapsed financially in the early 2000s with the arrival of digital piracy, and then rebuilt itself around streaming in the 2010s. The economics of streaming are such that artists need enormous numbers of plays to earn a meaningful income. An amount of music that would have generated a substantial royalty payment under the old sales model generates a fraction of that on a major streaming platform. Which means artists need volume. Volume means ubiquity. Ubiquity means being on as many playlists as possible, being recommended by as many algorithms as possible, being shared as widely as possible. The result is music optimized not for a listener sitting down with it, but for a listener who might skip it after 15 seconds. Songs have shortened. Intros have nearly disappeared. The first few seconds have to do work that once took a minute to accomplish, because the algorithm is counting every skip, every replay, every early exit. Albums, which were once a coherent artistic statement, a sequence of songs arranged to be heard in order, with purpose given to what comes after what, have become less commercially relevant. A playlist of individual tracks serves the streaming economy better than an album does, because each track can be placed in multiple playlists, each track can be recommended independently. The album as a form, the album as the place where an artist could take you somewhere and bring you back, has not disappeared, but it has become a marginal format in terms of commercial power. None of this happened because people became incapable of depth. It happened because the systems that produce and distribute culture reorganized themselves around a new set of incentives. Attention became the commodity, engagement became the metric, and meaning, genuine, slow, patient meaning, does not perform particularly well under those conditions. You cannot optimize for depth the way you can optimize for clicks. When people talk about feeling disconnected from contemporary culture, they often do it quietly, and usually in private. It is not the kind of thing that seems safe to say in a public conversation, because it can so easily be heard as snobbery, or as the predictable complaint of someone getting older and refusing to adapt, or as a refusal to give new things a fair chance. The social cost of saying it clearly is higher than most people want to pay. So instead, many people just quietly stop going to the cinema as often as they used to. They find themselves spending more time with older music. They reread books they already know. And they carry a small, unnamed sense of loss, a sense that something that used to be available to them has gradually become less so. Think about what it actually felt like to discover a film or an album that understood you. Not entertained you, not distracted you, understood you. That experience, of sitting with a piece of art and feeling, almost physically, that someone had looked closely at the texture of being human and had managed to capture something true, is not a minor thing. It is one of the ways that people locate themselves in the world. It is one of the ways we learn that our experience is not entirely private, not entirely isolated, not merely our own strange burden to carry alone. When a film shows you something about loneliness or love or grief or ordinary courage that matches something you have lived but never found words for, something in you settles. You feel less alone in the precise experience of being yourself. You feel less strange. This is what culture does at its best. This is what it can do, when it is made with that intention in mind. Now consider what happens when that experience becomes rare. When you go to a film and come out entertained but untouched. When an album plays through and you cannot remember a single moment of it an hour later. When you scroll through a list of celebrated new releases and find nothing that seems made for someone like you. Someone with history, with complexity, with questions that do not resolve into tidy lessons. The cultural landscape has not become empty. It has become crowded with things that were not made for you. And there is a particular kind of loneliness in that. It is different from the loneliness of having no one to talk to. This is the loneliness of being in a very loud room full of people having conversations you cannot quite enter. You are present, you can observe what is happening. You can understand the references, more or less. But you are not quite inside it. You are, in that room, a kind of invisible visitor. Some people respond to this by doubling down on older material. They watch the same films they watched at 30 or 40. They listen to the same records. And this brings real comfort. There is nothing shameful about returning to things that gave you something genuine. But it also carries a faint sadness over time, the sadness of knowing that the living relationship between yourself and contemporary culture has quietly concluded. That you are curating a private archive rather than participating in something ongoing. Others make genuine efforts to engage with what is current. They try the recommended shows, the celebrated albums, the films that everyone is discussing. And sometimes they find something worth their time. But often they come away with the sense that they are tourists in a foreign culture, able to observe its customs, able to see what makes it appealing to its native inhabitants, but never quite at home in it themselves. The references are unfamiliar. The emotional register is different. What the film or the show treats as profound does not feel profound. What it treats as funny does not quite land. And the experience of not laughing when everyone else is laughing, or of not being moved when everyone else apparently was, is its own small, quiet disorientation. There is also the specific experience of losing music as a companion. For many people who grew up before the current era, music was not background. It was not something you played behind other activities, a kind of sonic wallpaper to reduce the feeling of silence. It was something you sat with. You put on a record and you listened. You might not have done it with your full analytical attention, but you were genuinely there with the music. The whole arc of an album, its opening, its middle, its ending, became familiar, almost like a place you could return to. Certain albums became associated with specific periods of your life. They marked years. They held the mood of particular summers or winters. They became part of how you understood who you were at a given moment in time. That kind of relationship with music requires a particular kind of listening, and it requires music that was designed for that kind of listening. An album that has a shape, that builds, that earns its emotional moments by taking you through something first. That relationship is available now, but it requires more active seeking than it once did. The algorithmic surface of the music industry does not naturally lead you to it. It leads you toward what is already popular, what generates the most engagement, what fits most playlists. To find the music that asks something of you, you often have to go looking deliberately. And the grief of that, The quiet grief of realizing you have to fight for what used to simply arrive is part of what many people carry without quite knowing what to call it. There is also something worth naming about what happens when the shared cultural references disappear. Part of what culture does, in a social sense, is create a common language. When most of the people you know have seen the same films, or listened to the same music, or grown up with the same television, you have something to talk about. Not just the film itself, but the things the film made visible. The characters become shorthand. The scenes become metaphors. The shared experience of having been moved by something at roughly the same time, in roughly the same way, creates a kind of invisible bond. That bond weakens when the culture fragments. When everyone is watching something different, listening to something different, living inside their own algorithmic bubble, the shared references dissolve. Culture becomes private in a way it never quite was before. And with that, something quiet disappears from the texture of ordinary social life. To understand what has been lost, it helps to ask what art was always supposed to do, not in an academic sense, but in the most immediate, human sense. Why did people go to films? Why did music matter? Why did a well-told story feel necessary rather than simply pleasant? The answer is not complicated, even if it is hard to articulate precisely. Art gives us a way to understand our own experience. Not instructions for living, not moral prescriptions, not answers, necessarily. Something more immediate and more difficult to describe, a form of recognition. When a film captures the particular texture of grief, not grief in general, but grief with its specific weight and its unexpected moments of dark humor and its inconvenient tendency to arrive at the wrong times and then be absent when you expect it, something in the viewer responds. They feel recognized. Their experience, which seemed private and perhaps excessive, is reflected back to them from outside themselves. And in that reflection, something loosens. The isolation of the experience dissolves a little. This is why the loss of a scene in a film can make people cry in a way that real events sometimes cannot. It is not because the fictional scene is more emotionally intense than real life. It is because art can offer the shape of an experience in a way that real life, which is continuous and messy and full of distractions, often cannot. Art gives us a frame. It says, "Here, look at this particular thing. This is what it looks like. This is what it costs. This is what it does to the people it happens to." And when the frame is true, when the art has looked carefully enough at the thing to capture something real about it, we recognize it. And in that recognition, we feel less alone. The great films of the past were not great because they had better special effects or bigger budgets or more talented directors. Many of them were made under considerable constraint, with limited resources and uncertain outcomes. They were great because they were made with the clear conviction that the audience was a full human being, capable of complexity, willing to sit with discomfort, able to handle a story that did not resolve cleanly. That conviction shaped every decision: the pacing, the casting, the dialogue, the editing. The film trusted its audience. And audiences, trusted, tend to rise to that trust. That conviction is not compatible with content optimization. Content optimization asks a specific, legitimate business question. What keeps people watching? What keeps them engaged long enough to finish, to return, to recommend? Those are reasonable questions, but they are not the questions that produce art capable of changing someone's understanding of themselves. Because the answer to what keeps people watching is not the same as the answer to what gives people something they will carry for 20 years. Engagement and meaning are not opposites, but they pull in different directions when you make them the organizing principle of every decision. Engagement rewards momentum, clarity, satisfaction, the removal of ambiguity. Meaning sometimes requires its opposite: slowing down, complicating, withholding, allowing something to remain unresolved because unresolution is more honest than false closure. There is a difference between art that distracts and art that illuminates. Distraction is not without value. There are evenings when you want nothing more than to be carried somewhere else for a few hours and then returned, gently, to your own life. That is a real and valid desire. But it is different from the desire to be understood. And a culture that exclusively optimizes for distraction, even very sophisticated, expensive, beautifully executed distraction, stops serving that other need. The second half of life, in particular, is full of questions that contemporary mainstream culture rarely addresses with any seriousness. What do you do with time now that the relentless forward momentum of career and family has slowed? Who are you when the roles that organized your life, worker, parent, provider, builder, are complete or transformed? What does it mean to look back at the choices you made and notice what they actually cost, not in dramatic terms but in quiet, accumulated ways? How do you live with regret that is not sharp enough to be a crisis but too present to ignore? What is the correct relationship to a future that is shorter and less certain than it once appeared? How do you remain genuinely present in a life that has changed in ways you did not anticipate and would not have chosen? These are not small questions. They are some of the most serious questions a person can carry. They deserve serious art that takes them as its subject without flinching, without false comfort, without the need to resolve everything into a lesson or a redemption arc. Art that can look at the ordinary complexity of being older, the way the body changes and the mind sometimes does not follow the expected trajectory, the way love changes in long partnerships, the way time feels differently at 60 than it did at 30. The way friendship thins and the remaining friends become more valuable and more fragile, and say, yes. This is what this looks like. This is what this is. When culture stops making art about the full range of human experience, including aging, including the particular confusion of the years after the major decisions are made, including the experience of watching the world change in ways you did not expect and cannot entirely keep up with, it does not merely fail to entertain. It fails to witness, and to be witnessed is one of the things that human beings most fundamentally need. There is also a social dimension to this loss that goes beyond individual experience. Culture, at its best, is not merely entertainment. It is a collective act of sense-making. When a society produces art that seriously engages with its actual conditions, with what its members are actually experiencing, actually worried about, actually trying to understand, it creates the possibility of a shared language for those experiences. People who have never met can recognize each other across that shared language. They can say, yes, that is what I meant, I didn't know how to say it, but that is exactly it. When culture fragments into demographic silos, content for the young, content for the very young, content for specific interest groups, but very little that attempts to speak across the whole range of adult experience, that collective sense-making becomes harder. Each group is witnessed by content made for it, but the overlap shrinks. The conversations that happen across those silos become more difficult, because the shared references have disappeared. This is not a small cultural inconvenience. It affects how people understand each other, how they see themselves in relation to the society they are part of, how connected or disconnected they feel from the culture that surrounds them. A person who cannot find themselves reflected in any of the widely celebrated cultural products of their time does not simply have a personal problem. They are navigating a genuine absence. There is a temptation, when you think about what has been described in this video, to arrive at a clean conclusion. To say, the past was better, or things are hopeless now, or the young will eventually discover what was lost and bring it back. But all of those conclusions are too neat. They close down a question that deserves to stay open. What is actually true is more modest and, in a way, more useful. Something changed. The change was real. The disconnection that many adults feel from contemporary mainstream culture is not imaginary, not a sign of personal failure, not simply the predictable stubbornness of aging. It reflects a genuine reorganization of how entertainment is made and for whom. Naming that clearly is not nostalgia. It is accuracy. And accuracy, even when it is uncomfortable, is better than the alternative of carrying a vague sense of loss while quietly assuming the fault is yours. The fault is not yours. Your taste was formed by contact with things that were trying to do something serious. That is not a disadvantage. It is a form of education, even if an informal one. You learned, over years, what a well-constructed piece of art feels like. You learned the difference between a scene that is merely competent and a scene that reaches somewhere true. You carry that knowledge. It has not become worthless. It has simply become harder to apply in the mainstream. And at the same time, the culture did not end. The work that still speaks, that still takes the audience seriously as a full human being, that still makes room for complexity and patience and emotional truth, exists. It is harder to find in some ways. It is less likely to be the most discussed thing in any given week. But it is there. Foreign cinema has always been a resource for people who need something beyond what the domestic mainstream offers. Film traditions from countries with different economic pressures and different assumptions about what audiences can handle, France, Japan, South Korea, Iran, Romania, and many others, continue to produce work of genuine seriousness and emotional depth. These films are not obscure in the way that foreign films once were. Many of them are available on the same streaming platforms you already use. They simply require a small additional step, choosing something that was not engineered to be the first thing you see. Independent music has not disappeared. Artists who make records designed to be heard all the way through, who take the album form seriously, who write about adult experience with honesty and craft, they exist in every genre. They are harder to reach through algorithmic recommendation, because algorithms tend to push you toward what is already popular, what is already generating the most plays. But they are findable. Music writing, independent radio, word of mouth from people whose taste you trust. These paths still exist, even if they require slightly more effort than opening an app. Books continue to do what books have always done. Literature is not subject to the same economic pressures as film or music. A novel does not need to be seen by 100 million people to justify its existence. It does not need to be globally legible, franchise-ready, or optimized for an attention span measured in seconds. A novel can be slow. It can be demanding. It can be about the interior life of a 60-year-old navigating the particular strangeness of the years after the major decisions are made. Books do this. The ones that speak to adult experience are there. And occasionally, even in the mainstream, something arrives that was not supposed to. A film that found its way through the industrial machinery with its seriousness intact. A song that said something true in spite of every economic pressure not to. A television show that trusted its audience one more time. These things happen, less reliably than before, but they happen. And when they do, the response they generate, the particular gratitude people feel, as if they had been thirsty for a long time and had suddenly found water, confirms that the need is still there. That what was built, over decades, in the people who grew up with a certain kind of culture, did not simply dissolve. The point is not to mourn indefinitely. Mourning is appropriate for a time. It is honest, and honesty about loss is always more useful than pretending the loss did not happen. But after mourning, there is the question of what you do next. Your taste is not obsolete. It is not a relic. It is a compass, and compasses still work even when the terrain has changed. The direction it points may require more walking now. The path may not be marked as clearly as it once was. But the compass is still functioning, and you know what you are looking for, and that is more than most people can say about their own needs. Cultural orphanhood, that phrase we used near the beginning, is not a permanent condition. It is a circumstance, and like most circumstances, it can be responded to with either paralysis or motion. You can stop looking, settle for the comfortable repetition of things you already know, and let the relationship with living culture quietly conclude. Or you can keep looking, with some patience and some deliberateness, in places that require a small additional effort. The ones who keep looking, who remain genuinely curious, who are willing to be surprised by something they did not expect to find, who do not confuse loyalty to what moved them in the past with certainty that nothing in the present can do the same. Those are the people for whom culture remains a living thing. Not the mainstream culture, necessarily. Not the most celebrated or the most widely discussed. but the culture that was still made with someone like you in mind. The work that still assumes you are a full person, with history and complexity and the capacity to be patient. The silence of a culture that no longer quite speaks your language is not a verdict on you. It is a signal that the search has changed, that the path is less obvious than it was, that you may have to go a little further from the obvious center to find what you need. That has always been true, in some degree, for anyone who takes their own inner life seriously. The most nourishing things are rarely the most visible ones. They require the effort of seeking. They reward the patience of actually staying with something long enough to let it work. The culture that still speaks to you is out there. It always has been. It just does not always come looking for you. Maybe that is how it always should have been.